In the northernmost reaches of the United States, there is a train tunnel whose very foundations are saturated with the blood of the many workers who died hollowing it out. Disturbing encounters with spectral entities were reported both during its construction and for many years afterwards. What secrets lie at the heart of the Hoosac Tunnel hauntings? Throughout the early 1800s, American railroad engineers labored to find a way of connecting the northeastern city of Boston with the upstate districts of New York City. This was a massive undertaking and facilitated the need for a colorful variety of sub-projects and architectural features in order to successfully link the two cities. Key amongst these constructions was the requirement for a 5-mile stretch of tunnel directly underneath the Hoosac mountain chain, running parallel to the Deerfield River between the town of Florida and the city of North Adams. With only pickaxes, bare hands and rudimentary black powder explosives available, the going was tough, and many lives were lost to both tunnel collapses and a lack of ventilation. It was not until 1865, a full 14 years after the project had commenced, that the advent of nitroglycerin enabled the workers to make real headway through the unrelenting barriers of rock and clay. But this new technology did not come without a price, and it was not long after it was adopted that the first fatal accident occurred. On the afternoon of the 20th of March, a 3-man crew were experimenting with a new explosive at the head of the tunnel works. A worker named Ringo Kelly detonated the explosive charge before his 2 colleagues, Ned Brinkman and Billy Nash, had made it back to the safety of their operations bunker. The 2 men were killed instantly, crushed to death under an avalanche of falling rock and debris. In the aftermath of the incident, Kelly became isolated and withdrawn. He was skittish and nervous around his colleagues, claiming to see mysterious figures following him through the confines of the tunnel and hearing whispered voices whenever he was alone. Several days later, he disappeared altogether. Until his lifeless body was found 2 miles inside the tunnel, at the exact spot where Brinkman and Nash had been killed. The local sheriff concluded that Kelly had been strangled by one of his colleagues in revenge for the deaths, but nobody was ever formally questioned about the murder, and the rest of the workers also began to report encountering shadowy figures moving around just beyond the extent of the light from their lanterns. Sometimes these unknown figures could be heard apparently groaning in pain, or on occasion, they would deafeningly shriek out in terror. Word soon spread that the ghosts of the 2 men now inhabited the tunnel, which led to a mass walkout, with a number of miners electing to leave the site for good. Eventually, the project managers began to seek assistance from local clergymen and scholars, in an effort to stop the ghost stories, which had resulted in a notable downturn in productivity. In 1868, Paul Travers was asked to come and inspect the site, to see if the rumors could finally be dispelled once and for all. Travers was a qualified mechanical engineer, and had been a respected cavalry officer during the Civil War. Rather than agreeing with the construction company that the noises were wind blowing down through the tunnel network, the engineer instead sided with the workers. He claimed that during his visit, he had been bombarded with the sounds of the dead and the dying. Chilling reverberations he had not experienced since the Battle of Shiloh. But as unsettling as Paul Travers' experience was, the most chilling accident ever to occur at the site would not be long in coming. An incident that would forever be etched in the memories of those associated with it. A month after Travers' tunnel inspection had taken place, there was a gigantic explosion in the facility's central pumping station, following an unexpected buildup of naphtha gas. The 13 subcontractors who were laboring in the tunnel at the time were all caught in the blast. Most were killed instantly, crushed underneath huge sections of burning wreckage. As it would transpire, they would be the lucky ones. The few survivors quickly discovered there was no way back up to the surface, and found themselves being pushed deeper and deeper into the depths of the tunnel works by an unending wave of muddy water. Those that did not drown survived a while longer, having fashioned a makeshift raft to cling onto, but with the tunnel's air pumps destroyed in the explosion, they eventually suffocated. A worker by the name of Mallory volunteered to be lowered down in a bucket at a point further down the tunnel, hoping that he could retrieve at least some of his fallen colleagues. When he was hauled back up several minutes later, he was barely conscious. Between weak breaths, he told his managers there were no survivors to be seen. And all of the bodies were gone. Where, he did not know. It took several long months to drain the site, and during that time, at least some of the mangled and bloated corpses eventually found their way out of the flooded tunnel and into surrounding waterways. Local residents began to contact the police, claiming to have been guided to the remains of the dead workers by mysterious figures, who immediately disappeared when each body was found. One workman claimed to have seen a string of men making their way down to a nearby water-filled pit, pickaxes on their shoulders, and a lantern at the front of the column. The figures did not reply when he had called out, and after he had followed them for a short distance, he suddenly found that they had vanished completely, leaving behind no footprints or other trace of their passage in the wet mud beneath their feet. On his arrival at the pit, the worker could just about make out a dark shape floating in the center of the pool. Suddenly, a pained cry broke the silence around him, the anguished scream of a soul in utter torment. As the high-pitched wail continued, the man covered his ears, casting the light from his lantern onto the object in the water. The dim candlelight revealed the bloodied and broken remains of a young laborer, not even 18 years old, clearly one of the victims of the flooded tunnel. As soon as he realized what he was looking at, the man lowered his hands from his ears, the screaming stopped, and he was once again all alone. The young laborer had vanished. When the last body of the 13 dead workers had been recovered and provided with a proper burial, reports of spectral figures subsided. But the sounds of disembodied voices groaning and shrieking in the dark depths of the construction works continued, prompting the owners to make further steps to rationalize what was taking place. On the evening of the 25th of June, 1874, Superintendent James R. McKinstry arrived at the site. He was the drilling operations manager for the project and had enlisted the services of a university lecturer, Dr. Clifford J. Owens. McKinstry unlocked the gates to the building works, and the two men descended into the bowels of the tunnel, in search of answers. Owens would later describe the tunnel as being as cold and dark as a tomb. They had not traveled far when both suddenly halted, as an eerie and unsettling commotion floated up towards them from the dark depths. It sounded like a human being in great pain. It was then that Owens became aware of a dim light, steadily making its way up towards them. When the light drew near, Owens could see that it was an unnaturally blue color, unlike anything he had ever seen before. As it neared them, it suddenly seemed to change shape, morphing into a roughly humanoid figure, but with an empty space where the head should have been. McKinstry and Owens both found themselves holding their breath as the shape came to a halt directly in front of them. It was hovering a few feet above the ground, and seemed to be slightly regarding the two men. For a moment, there was nothing but a cold and depressive silence, before the apparition emitted a mournful shriek, and retreated into the darkness it emerged from. Further incidents would also indicate that the supernatural occurrences associated with the project were not simply restricted to the tunnel shaft itself. 3 months after Dr. Owens' experience, a local hunter named Frank Webster disappeared whilst out in the woods not far from the worksite. It would be 3 days before he was found again, in a disorientated state on the banks of the Deerfield River. Webster claimed that he had been hunting deer in the forest. When he had heard someone calling to him, he had followed the voices through the trees, and into a nearby fissure in the mountain rock. In the dim light of the cave, he could see the shadowy outlines of figures working on the rock around him, but they were completely silent. Not even their pickaxes striking the rock made a sound, and they did not respond when he called out to them. The hapless woodsman then described how his hunting rifle had been snatched from his grasp by an invisible force, and he had been repeatedly beaten with it until he lost consciousness. His rescuers would later note how Webster did not have his rifle with him when he was found, and was indeed covered in livid bruises and abrasions, as if he had been subjected to a violent assault. The first train successfully passed through the Hoosac Tunnel on the February 9, 1875. The project had taken over 25 years to complete, costing millions of dollars, but it was the human cost that was felt most by the men who had worked on it. Over 200 workers had lost their lives within the suffocating darkness beneath the mountains. The eventual opening of the railway line meant that there were now far less reports of disembodied voices emanating from inside the mountain, but reports of unearthly balls of light emerging from the depths of the tunnel during the hours of darkness still persisted, and other unsettling events also continued to take place. In autumn of 1875, an employee of the Boston Main Railway Company, named Harlan Mulvaney, was delivering a wagon load of timber to the tunnel in order to replace some of the wooden supports that had become damaged. The other men attached to the maintenance team had been waiting for him at the entrance, and had waved at him as he passed. As Mulvaney's colleagues had lit their lanterns and gathered their tools to follow him, they were suddenly shocked to see the wagon come bolting past them back out of the tunnel, the horses pulling it, kicking and bucking wildly as they ran. Mulvaney was stood upright in his seat, his face etched in terror, whipping furiously at the animals. A few days later, a local hunter located the wagon and the horses, standing unattended in a forest clearing 3 miles away. The timber lay undisturbed, with Mulvaney's coat and pipe sitting discarded on his seat, of Mulvaney himself. There was no sign. He was never seen again. During the 1970s, there was a renewed wave of public interest in the tunnel after the story of its haunting was published in a national newspaper. Researchers and paranormal investigators flocked to the site, equipped with sound recording equipment and cameras, in the hopes of collecting some evidence that the Hoosac Tunnel phenomenon genuinely existed. One such individual was a man named Bernard Ostabar, who announced in 1973 that he would walk the full length of the tunnel in order to prove that the whole affair was a hoax. Watched by a small group of onlookers, he entered at the North Adams end of the tunnel and was never seen again. A rescue team that retraced his steps the following day found no evidence suggesting what might have happened to him. In 1976, an investigator claimed that one evening he had come face to face with the ghostly figure of an old man, dressed in miner's overalls. The man was seemingly backlit by a brilliant white light, and walked straight through a sheer rock face when challenged. Another researcher named Ollie Allmaker claimed to have felt an unearthly presence stood next to her when she ventured into the tunnel, and to have caught the muffled sounds of crying and groaning on a tape recorder she had with her at the time. However, it would seem that not all of the spirits who dwelt within the Hoosac Tunnel were malevolent in nature. And some were even protective of the men who worked there. One railroad employee by the name of Joseph Impico swore that the tunnel ghosts had saved his life on 2 separate occasions. One evening, he had been working on a bend of the rail line not far from the tunnel's north entrance, shipping ice from the tracks. Suddenly a male voice had whispered in his ear, "Run, Joe, run." Impico had stopped what he was doing and looked around, but there was not a soul to be seen. Seconds later, Impico had felt a violent shove to his chest, and fell backwards away from the tracks. Within moments, the number 60 engine had come streaming around the bend at unexpectedly high speed. Without the warning and accompanying push, Impico had little doubt he would have been killed instantly by the speeding locomotive. 6 weeks later, he was again working on his own to free up some frozen freight cars, when a similar incident occurred. This time he had been straining to part the heavy train wheels from the frozen track, when the same unknown voice had whispered, "Joe, Joe, drop it, Joe." Instinctively, Impico had let go of the metal crowbar he was holding, only to see it immediately jolted and thrown violently against the tunnel wall by over 11,000 volts of electricity. An overhead power line had short-circuited and fallen onto the tracks nearby, meaning that Impico's unseen guardian had once again saved his life. The sheer scale of the human loss experienced by the builders of the Hoosac Tunnel earned it a haunting nickname, the Bloody Pit. The location still remains in use today, with the Boston and Maine Rail Corporation running through it up to 12 freight trains a day. It remains one of the longest active running railway lines in the world, and is arguably the most haunted. Are we to believe that for a quarter of a century, men working on one of America's most ambitious construction projects were terrorized and attacked by the spirits of their fallen co-workers? Or is there perhaps a more rational explanation for what took place in this lonely and isolated area of Massachusetts? In any corner of the globe, you will find that any place has stories of ghosts and other spirits associated with it. When fatal accidents occur, it is all too easy to blame subsequent tragic happenings on the restless souls of those who died there in the past. In the stifling and claustrophobic darkness of the underground tunnel, it is terrifying to imagine what tricks and misconceptions the darkness and lack of oxygen might have played on those unfortunate enough to be laboring there, robbed of their senses due to a lack of light and ventilation. every minor sound and movement could all too easily have been misinterpreted as something far more sinister. That said, the unsolved deaths and disappearances that occurred at the site do raise questions that are difficult to answer, and elevate the tunnel to a level of scrutiny that perhaps other, more notorious haunted locations do not necessarily generate. Maybe there is indeed truth in the reports of the workers, and the spirits of some of those killed underground have yet to find their way back to the surface.